Hello, and welcome to ABAdesk. To get started, let's log in. The first thing you'll see is a task analysis, kind of going over what to do. Obviously, we're going to go over quite a bit today, so don't worry about this. Should you ever need to return to it, just click on the logo. We're going to go over the knowledge base. Here you're going to find tons of information, like an article on pretty much every little button and what it does, as well as video models on how to create programs. If you ever need some help, you can use the support link. Anybody from within the company can request support. It is free. There is a 24-hour turnaround time on support tickets. With the support link, you're able to not only report issues, but also ask questions like what's the best way to do something, for example, or if you're not sure how something works, we're happy to explain that to you. In ABAdesk proper, there are two places to go. We've got the dashboard, which is the clinical end of things, and then we've got the admin side, and this is more company-wide. Only those with admin permissions can actually access the admin menu. All right, on the admin menu, we're going to see kind of a few spots. As the account holder, you're going to have access to the account link and the BAA. No one else with admin permissions will be able to see these two links. The account link is where you're going to go in and actually modify your client quantity that you're paying for, update your payment method, or if you had to cancel your account, you would do that here as well. If you ever need to reinstate your account after leaving, you just have to reach out and we can kind of flip that switch for you. We also have a BAA for your records. So what we're going to do, we're going to hop over to the clients page and actually add in a client in just a second. Before we do that, I wanted to go over these values here. So your active client number is just, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, however many clients you have active. Only your active clients are being counted against your client maximum. So if you're no longer working with somebody, as long as they've been active for 30 days, you can go ahead and make them inactive, and that's going to open up a spot for somebody else. If you'd rather, reduce your client maximum, aka the amount that you're actually paying for, right, you would just go to admin and account and just reduce that number, and you'd actually receive a prorated credit toward your next bill for that unused portion. If you need to increase your client quantity just to make room for somebody else, you would just use the account link to do that, and it would just be a prorated payment based on how far you are in the billing period. So we're going to hit the plus here to add a client, and you can see we don't actually require a whole bunch, just 3 fields. So we're going to create a really originally named client called dummy client, and I'm just going to put a random date of birth. Right, and you can see there is that dummy client that we've added kind of in that first 3 format. Next up, we're going to go back to the admin side, and we're going to go to therapists. So this is the page where we're going to add in anybody who needs a user account. You'll notice as the account holder that when you first log in, you're already here because you're logged in. But anyone else, right, we would just hit the plus, fill this out, and once we hit save, it'll trigger an email for them to get so they can set up their password. If they can't find it, make sure they check their all mail and spam folders, as sometimes it does like to play hide and seek. In the event that they didn't get it, what you'll be able to do is just log out and hit forget password and just enter their email here, and it'll trigger an equivalent email. Obviously, make sure that their email was entered correctly in the system. If not, make adjustments first. They can also do this for themselves if they ever forget their passwords, or if you do. So I'm just going to log back in, go back to the therapist page, and one more thing I wanted to go over here, which is the title. So their title is going to be their permission level within the system. If you ever need a rundown of the permission levels, it'll be in the knowledge base under the therapist directory article. And there we are. You can always modify this later. All right, if somebody's no longer working for you, then you can make them inactive, and that'll unassign all of the clients, and then they won't be able to get into the system either. While we're here, we're going to assign that client that we made to ourselves so we can actually see them in our dashboard. So we're going to go to client list. I'm going to find the dummy client here and just pop them over to the right hand side. If I wanted to add everybody, I would just use this button instead. All right, hit and save. All right, next up, what we're going to do, we're going to hop over to the admin side again. We're going to go to company programs. So this is going to be your company program library. Initially, it'll be a lot more like a shelf because it'll be a blank slate for you to add programs in that you might reuse in some capacity. I say in some capacity just because they do look different from client to client, as they should. So once you actually add a company program to a client, you can modify it however you want to fit the individual, and any changes you make are not going to impact the company program, and vice versa. If you have programs that are a little more client specific, like an oddball behavior, like talking way too much about dinosaurs, probably not a frequent flyer, so we can add that directly to the client instead. You do not have to put it here. If you ever want to reuse it though, make sure you do add it as a company program. To add a company program, we're just going to hit the plus, select a recording type. You can see currently we offer duration, frequency, interval recording, task analysis, and trials. These first three options are available for both acquisition goals as well as behaviors for decrease. So you just kind of let us know on the form how you want to use it. You'll notice if you select behavior for decrease that the form will grow to include the fields, replacement behavior, and function of behavior. Any information that's written here or updated, obviously once it's assigned to a client, you'll be able to pull up that information while you're actually in session taking data. We also have some phase settings here. And I'll go over programs in great detail once we actually add programs to a client. But that was kind of the basic layout of the form. If you no longer want to use a company program, just make it inactive. It'll just go right down here to the archives, and you can always bring it back as needed. You'll see everything is sorted alphabetically, so if you need things kind of sorted in a special way, just add a prefix that they all have, and then they'll all be kind of sorted the way you want them to. You can also kind of filter through here if don't want to scroll a whole bunch. All right, next up, what we're gonna do, we're gonna hop over to the dashboard. And you can see that client that I assigned to myself is right here. I wanna go over how to actually add programs to the client. As we do this, I will show you how to modify them as well on an individual basis. So let's go to client programs. Only those with lead or admin permissions can actually modify client programming. You can see this client does not have any programs yet, so we're going to hit the plus to add a program. If we wanted to add an existing company program, we'll find it here, and then we'll be able to adjust it as needed. Otherwise, if we wanted to create something special just for this client, like that talking way too much about dinosaurs behavior, right, we would just hit the plus again, and they get their very own form. Same forms you saw before, they're just client specific. Again, if you want to reuse a program, go back and add it as a company program first. All right, so first up, let's add aggression. So this is a frequency program. We're always going to have to pick a category, so if you're not sure, just put other. I promise it will not impact how ABAdesk works. This is definitely a behavior for decrease. If I then wanted to add in, maybe an operational definition or some non-examples, like high fives don't count as aggression, so that information can actually be accessed in session, I can go in and fill in those details. I can always come back and fill that out later. There will be some fields that are not editable once there is data for the program, like the master criteria, for example. The mastery criteria is going to be going toward that treatment phase. We have other phase options as well. I'm not going to go over these just yet, just because I'm guessing we don't want to maintain or generalize aggression. I will go over these once we get into an acquisition goal, but I promise the settings are all the same regardless of the recording type you've chosen. So in this case, it's just going to go straight into treatment. As soon as it's mastered, what's going to happen is it's going to draw a phase line on the graph, and it's going to move into a phase called additional data, since we didn't choose maintenance or generalization. The additional data phase allows you to continue tracking it as long as you want to, so you can catch things like spontaneous recovery on your graphs. If you don't want to continue tracking it once it's been mastered, or it's gone through whatever else you've set it out to go through, then you can just set it to archive when complete, and it'll just kind of remove it from your session, so it won't be taking up space when it's not needed. For frequency programs, by the way, what we're comparing against the mastery value is just the regular old frequency. On the graph, you will also be able to see rate per hour, so you can still compare sessions that vary in length. All right, next we're going to add a duration program. So hitting the plus again, and this time we are going to add crying. There it is. You can see this is a duration one. This form is identical otherwise. And you can see here what we're comparing against the mastery value for a duration program is total duration, since you can track multiple instances of a behavior in a given session. On the graph, you will also be able to see average duration for occurrence. Mind you, it's a drop down, so you can show or hide either or see both. All right, next we're going to do interval recording. So I'm going to hit the plus, and then let's look for playing with peers at recess. And we can see here, we're going to choose a method. I'm sure you've seen the interval recording data sheets. In general, they're just boxes that we put pluses and minuses into. So whatever method you choose, we will display the respective instructions on how to actually use that method. So you don't actually have to write it here. You can save other details like that, like observing out of line of sight or whatever else you want, or nothing, because it's not required. You'll see a lot of these fields are not required, so if you do have binders filled with information you worked really hard to put in there, you don't have to do that. But if you do want to access this information quickly, I do recommend filling it in. Our observation length, right, so the total time we're watching, and then the size of our intervals. As long as they divide evenly, you do get some nice little feedback here. Otherwise, you will get some corrective feedback. For the purpose of this training video, we are only going to observe for 20 seconds, just so it's not like watching paint dry as the timer goes through. These values would not be able to be adjusted after there is data for the program, so make sure you kind of pick something that makes sense for your session. All right, our mastery criteria. So we can go up to 100, but it doesn't have to be, just like with behaviors for decrease, it doesn't have to be 0. It's just what I happen to put. You do have to put things that make sense though. So if we've got an acquisition goal, for example, you will get some feedback, like we cannot increase to 0. I'm just gonna put 100. All right, so obviously this mastery criteria, that's gonna be counted toward the treatment phase. If you want other phases used as well, then just kind of line these up prior to running the program for the first time. So you can pick and choose what we need. You don't have to choose all of these guys. Just pick whatever you need and it'll move through accordingly. In this case, what's going to happen is after 3 sessions of baseline are submitted, then the following session, it'll automatically transition into the treatment phase. It'll draw a phase line in between these phases, and in session, you will know what phase it's in. It'll tell you right there when you pop it open to take data. If it's mastered in baseline, then it's actually going to skip the treatment phase, since they've kind of proven they can do it here. Otherwise, if it wasn't mastered in baseline, it'll just move into the treatment phase. After it's mastered, whether that mastery happened in baseline or in treatment, then the following session, it'll go into maintenance. Here, you're just putting in however many sessions of maintenance you want to do. And again, you can modify this from client to client, so don't feel like you have to stick to the settings that were put here for someone else or for a company program. And then the repeat is just going to say, how often do you actually want to see this program in your session, daily, weekly, or monthly. Based on your settings here, it's going to be available when it's time for it to be run and hidden away when it's not. If you didn't track it on Monday, for example, it'll be there on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. And then generalization, so however many sessions of that you want to do. Again, we're going to get phase lines in between all of these. After it's kind of gone through everything you've set it out to do, it'll move into that additional data phase you want to keep tracking it. But if you don't, right, you can just set it to not go in the additional data phase, aka archive when complete. All right, next up, we are going to go over task analysis. So here's one for hand washing. We're going to add that. And you can see here we've got some steps, right? So you can just add some more in if you need to. If I need to modify this from client to client, right? So if this little buddy likes to have bubble parties, I might want to specify that we just want 1 pump of soap instead of 10. Then we're going to see what kind of data we want to take. Do we want to know if they just got it right or wrong, or how much help they actually needed to get there? If you select prompt level, we're going to use a standard drop down in the session, so we'll see what that looks like when we get there. And then we're going to select our chaining type. So if we set it to total task, we will just start off by taking data on everything right away. It's pretty uneventful. If you set it to forward chaining or backward chaining, then what's going to happen is you're still going to see all the steps, but only the step that we're actually tracking. So for forward chaining, for example, right, we're only initially just tracking the first step. That's the only one that's going to have buttons next to it for tracking in session. As soon as step 1 is mastered, aka step 1 was correct in this case for 2 consecutive sessions. Then the following session, step 2, will also have a set of buttons for tracking. So basically, they just earn more buttons as they master stuff, and whoever's taking data will always know which steps the client's responsible for because they're the ones with the buttons next to it. Minimum trials. So this one's kind of important. So this is you as a supervisor indicating, hey, if you're going to run this program, I need you to run it at least once, twice, 3 times, etc. They will have to meet your minimum in order for those data to be submittable, so make sure you put something that's feasible. If you don't run the program, that's also totally fine, but if you do, you would have to meet that minimum. If you don't know how sticky the day is going to get, it's just a minimum. You can add trials as you go in the moment, so you can just set it to 1 if you need some flexibility. Alrighty, next we're going to go over a few variations of trials just because everybody does it a little bit differently. When you're creating a trials program, consider how many targets you want running, and if you want running, a few of them run together, or, switching them out individually over time. So I'll go over all of those examples. So we'll start off with something simple like a single target goal, like appropriate protesting, right? We want them to use functional communication instead of aggression for escape, for example. So data type, do we want to take plus minus or prompt level data? I'm just going to set it to plus minus. Minimum trials, do I know how many times they're going to need to protest in a given day? Probably not, so I'm just going to set it to minimum trials 1. If, it just doesn't happen in a session, that's fine, but if we do need to track it, then we can just add trials as opportunities arise. And then, right, plus minus prompt level data, same thing as you saw before. This format field here is just tacting your behavior here. You can see there's 1 target, so there it is right there. And in this case, right, we're working on appropriate protesting, so I could just say the appropriately protest as the target, but I decided to add a little more detail just for better quality data. This is a single target goal, so this one is pretty straightforward, right? Just some mastery criteria. That's kind of the whole thing. Next, we're going to add a program with a few more targets involved, so let's work on colors. That is a pretty vaguely named program. You can see I didn't specify if we're working on these receptively or expressively, only because I can actually add this program to the client twice and it's going to change the name based on its use. So I'm going to add it and I'm going to change it over to colors expressive, right? So what's this? Blue. All right, and you'll see this time there's a little bit more than 1 target, so it says something a little bit different here. Otherwise, everything is pretty similar to what you saw before. And you can see I had set it to have a few targets in a given list instead of just 1 target at a time. So it starts off looking a little bit more like this, right? So just like that appropriate protesting one. When you're creating lists, it's good to consider how many targets do you actually want running concurrently, and also if targets are grouped in a list, each target would have to be run anytime that list is run. So make sure, if we're working on colors, don't put the whole Crayola box, into one list, just because that would be a very overwhelming amount, unless you can actually, feasibly achieve that in a session. Otherwise, limit it to however many you want tracked. The reason that we require all targets in a given list to be tracked within a given session is the way that it's being scored. So kind of like a teacher grading a test, right? If they got 1 wrong, that would be 67% correct currently if we had 3 targets. Let's actually add some targets in. So red, blue, and yellow. Cool. And again, each target is not being scored separately. It is being scored as that percent correct of a whole because it's in a list. If you want some more flexibility and that you don't always want to run the same ones, it would just be a different setup, and I'll go over that in a little bit with a different program. But in this case, we're going to track all of these guys anytime we run it. You'll notice once there is data for a list, the targets will not be editable, so kind of set this up wisely as you're doing it. As soon as a given list is done with whatever you've set it out to do, you want it to move on to something else. You can actually plan this ahead of time, so let's hit next list. Now that we have 2 lists, we're going to have to go back and call the first one something like primary colors, or I can be lazy and just call it list 1. That's totally fine. Just make it different from the next one so you can tell them apart. Right, and then we're going to add some secondary colors. As you create lists, it's good to know that each list does not have to have the same amount of targets. A list could just have 1 target. So, all right, so we're going to add green, purple, and orange. Now, it's good to know that each list is being tracked separately from the other, and each list is going through different phases kind of independently of the other, and each one is going to be graphed separately as well. Now you can see initially in session, only list 1 is shown. Assuming we did set it to go through baseline, treatment, maintenance, and generalization, then initially in session, right, it's going to be in baseline. After it's done with baseline, if it was mastered in baseline, it would skip treatment. Otherwise, it would just move into treatment. Whenever mastery is achieved, then the following session, not only are we going to be able to start taking maintenance on list 1, but we're automatically going to trigger list 2 to activate on its own. So we're going to be able to start taking data on list 2. These changes are going to happen at the start of every session, so you will have to start a new session in order to kind of see that change. You can see kind of as soon as list 1 is done with whatever you've set it out to do, it's going to go into that additional data phase, kind of like a program would, which is great if you want to keep tracking it, but kind of annoying and in the way if you don't want to keep tracking it. So if you don't want it to go into that additional data phase, you can set it to hide completed lists, so it just kind of cleans up your session, so only what's relevant would actually be there. You can see currently it is shown. If you set it to hide completed lists, this would say hidden once it's actually kind of gone through everything you've set it out to do. You can also manually hide it if you realize this list is not appropriate. You can also manually activate the next list if you wanted to. So if you wanted to have, this one running or both of them running concurrently, that would be totally fine. All right. Next, I'm going to add colors receptively, and this time obviously in much less detail because we did already go over the form, but I'm just going to add it and just change the name to receptive, and everything else otherwise kind of stays the same. So you can see we added it twice with not a whole lot of effort that second time around. All right, next we're going to go over if we want to have targets kind of scored separately, graphed separately, just so you're not stuck running the whole list anytime you run it. So let's add this gross motor imitation program. You can see here I did choose prompt level data instead of plus minus, but otherwise very similar. And you can see each target is just in its own list. And the name of the list is just the name of the target, just so in session you can easily identify it. Now, obviously, we might want to target discrimination at the same time, right, instead of just working on one target at a time. So we'll just activate the ones we want to see in session. And then final program, let's work on responding to name. So let's assume we want them to come when their name is called, initially from 5 feet, then 10 feet, then 15 feet, and we want that to progress automatically. I have it set to hide completed lists, and I don't have any other phases selected, so it's just going to go into treatment and then move on. So you can see the list is, called coming from 5 feet, and then I just added a little more detail here, like initiating that response within 10 seconds. Otherwise, I could just say they come from 5 feet. So that's kind of up to you. I have it set to hide completed lists. So as soon as this one is mastered, because it's only set for the treatment phase, right? So if it's mastered in treatment, then the following session, this one's automatically going to be hidden. And we're only going to see this one because it's automatically going to activate. And then as soon as this one is done, it's going to be gone. And we're only going to see this one. And we can keep going and keep adding to it later if we want to. All right, so if we want to kind of see what all of this turned into, let's go to the dashboard and actually start a session. In order to do that, we're going to have to hit start session. As soon as we enter a valid date, start time, and end time, our programs are going to show right where this line is. By valid dates and times, I just mean your sessions must be submitted in chronological order, so make sure the dates that you enter don't cut in front of or overlap with an existing session that's been submitted. If you're not sure, you can just go to the dashboard and click on session notes, and that's going to give you a list of all of the sessions that have been submitted over time. So I'm going to put in today's date, but right now this client doesn't have any data or any sessions at all, so any date would be fine. I recommend using these little clock buttons just to get something within these fields here. Otherwise, there's a pesky little error that pops up because it doesn't like emptiness. So you can see in Colorado, it is 4:08 p.m. for me. Obviously, we cannot start and end a session at the same time because that's just kind of walking past the kid and not doing anything. So, let's go from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, for example. You can see all of our programs show now. Behaviors for decrease up top because you kind of need those in a pinch. And then your acquisition goals right down here in alphabetical order. You can see, right, colors expressive primary. We don't see that secondary list because we're not quite ready for it. That'll be automatically put there kind of as soon as primary is mastered. And then with that gross motor imitation one, right, clap, spin, and jump, each list we're tracking separately, which is why you see them kind of each in their own little parts. If you were on a smaller device or if you're doing telehealth and you want to save some screen real estate, ABAdesk is pretty bendy. So if you're on a phone, for example, it will already be this size. All right, so let's grow up again. All right, all set. Now you can see this little progress section here, just so you can kind of keep track of what you've done, what you haven't done, if you have any timers running, for example. You'll notice it says no data here. So it's good to know that for behaviors for decrease, no data does not mean that it didn't happen and that you're getting a dot at 0, right, on your graph. So if it didn't happen and you want to kind of give credit where credit is due, what I like to do, start my sessions off by popping this open and just clicking anywhere outside of it to close it. Now you can see it very explicitly states that it's 0. I'm going to do the same thing for this duration program, right? Just pop it open, click anywhere outside of it to close, same thing. If it does actually happen, we're just going to pop it open, right, and just track it. And you can see, by the way, the phase is treatment. If I'm not sure if the behavior that just occurred kind of fits the operational definition, I'm just going to hit the question mark, and anything that was written on the form I'll be able to access here. And if you don't need it, it's kind of out of the way. If you got a little overzealous, you can also go back if you need to and come back to this whenever you want, just because, it doesn't always happen all at once. And same goes for the rest of your programs. You don't have to run all of your trials in one sitting, just get it in prior to, submitting in general. Here's the duration one, right? So whenever the behavior starts, we're gonna hit start. If they multitask, so can you, that's okay. And whenever it stops, you hit stop. If you didn't have your device handy at the moment, we're just gonna hit input and then you can just type it in. That would be totally fine. We do recommend anytime you have a timer actively running, which we don't, we recommend not leaving the page, just because if you do, the timer will clear, only because we don't want you to come back 3 days later and the timer's still going, because your graphs are probably going to look a little bit off. So if you did accidentally clear it by leaving the page, you can always just manually type it in. Before we take some more data, I did want to give some basic session recommendations. So first things first, you should be accessing ABAdesk in your browser directly. So if you're on a phone, for example, don't create a shortcut, on your phone's dashboard that goes directly to the portal. Access it kind of through the regular browser. We also recommend not using things like incognito mode, just because that'll cause things to clear, and that's always bad. And then the most important one is only have your session open while you're actually kind of, looking at it, clicking, scrolling, typing, taking data, etc. Anytime you're not doing that, right, if you have to open up another tab, if you have to, let your device time out or put it in your pocket or just open up another app like YouTube for reinforcement, right? We're just going to hop over to the dashboard anytime we do that, and that is going to keep our data safe. Mind you, our sessions are saving to the server literally every 30 seconds without you having to do anything. But my best analogy for this is browsers are kind of like toddlers, in that if you leave a toddler alone for a while and they get really quiet, they're up to no good. So same thing with browsers, and each one behaves a little bit differently, which can result in data loss. So just go back to the dashboard anytime you're not actively using your session, and that's going to keep your data safe from being erased. So what we're going to do, we're going to resume our session by hitting start session. You can see it's not gone, right? We're going to see open sessions because it's already here. And there's that session. In the event that our internet ever gets a little bit wonky, our session actually has everything we need to keep going. And what it's going to do is it's going to start saving into your device's cache. So it's going to start saving locally. If you did have wonky internet at any point, you might see a locally saved version of your session here, right? So same date and time values here. And what you're going to do when you resume your session is just resume the one that's got the most data, which you can see right here, right? How many programs I actually opened and actually ran to completion. I'm going to resume it, and you can see everything is there as I left it. Don't worry about this save session button here, because everything's going to be saving every 30 seconds anyway. But if you are feeling impatient or you want to skedaddle early, right, just hit save session. All right, and then if you are offline, your session will continue to work, only the session, not any other part of ABAdesk, but your session will continue to work exactly as it does. And instead of saving to the server, again, it's gonna be saving locally. So instead of seeing this teal option here, it's gonna be, or not option, but pop-up, but it's gonna be orange instead, and it's gonna say saving locally. All right, so let's take some more data. So here's that single target goal, right? That appropriate protesting program, right? They said, no, stop it, cool. If another opportunity arose, right, we would just add a trial and track it again. Or if we were wrong, right, we can always go back and fix it. And you can see here's that primary colors one. In this case, we set it to have 3 targets running concurrently, which means anytime we run this, we would have to track all 3 in order for those data to be submittable. So we're gonna, track it, and of course, in the middle of tracking it, or running this program, they're probably gonna ask to use the bathroom. It's the best time to go. When you get back, you might ask yourself, what was I doing? Did I finish? So you can take a peek at this progress section here and see that these 2 numbers are not equal, thus you're not done. So I can just go back in and track it. If we're taking baseline and I'm like, I wonder if they're guessing, right? Just add a trial and you can be like, yes, they were. It happens. If we wanted to track right, clap, spin, or jump, those we're doing separately. So we're just going to pop open one of these guys and see we're only kind of responsible for tracking clap in this version, or in this list. And you can see here I selected prompt level data, which is why instead of seeing the plus minus buttons, you see a drop down. If this just looks like somebody spilled alphabet soup, just hit show key, and now we see words like a textual prompt. What's pretty cool about this, especially if you run, multiple trials, you might want to know whatever the most obtrusive prompting level used was during the session. So once this is submitted, you'll notice on your graph that above this specific program's dot for the day, it's going to say PP above it, because that is the most obtrusive prompt level. All right, let's see that task analysis for hand washing. And you can see here are all of our steps where you were using forward chaining. So initially the only step that we're tracking is step 1, because that's kind of all the learner's responsible for. As soon as they master step 1, then you'll notice 2 buttons for tracking the following session instead of just the 1. All right, let's do interval recording. We'll pop that open. And you can see we're using partial interval. If you hit the question mark, here are the instructions for partial interval recording. You don't have to write these out because those are already included based on the form that you set up. We're going to observe for 20 seconds because we set it to something really, really short. This interval countdown is going to start moving as soon as we hit this start our observation, and that's just going to tell you how long until each interval is done. Here we go. You can see we're only on interval 1, thus it's the only one we need right now. Now we're on interval 2, and you can see this countdown running in the background as well. And if the behavior does happen, right, you would just click on it, or if you made a mistake, you can unclick it. And we'll take that data as well. And once it's good to go, you can see it just gives you a percentage. If you weren't paying attention, you can always just, clear it out and start over if you need to. And then here is that coming from 5 feet behavior. You can see I set it to minimum trials 5 just so we don't get that, either 0 or 100% correct data. And you can see since it's minimum trials 5 that you see the same target 5 times. If we need some more practice, right, just add a trial and that's fine. All right, below you're gonna see our standard session note fields. Mind you, none of these are required, so if you don't need them, just keep scrolling. You don't have to put NA or anything like that. You can see we have examples of what you could write, so hopefully you don't get those terrible notes that say, we did stuff and it was awesome, good day, no behaviors. Questions for supervisor field, so anything that's written here, the moment that they hit submit, this is gonna trigger the supervisor, aka the lead or admin assigned to this case, to receive an email with a reference to that question. Mind you, it won't be the question itself, just a way to find it, right? The client identifier, the date of the session, and the name of the person who wrote the question. If your documentation requires a signature, make sure you get that in just prior to submitting. So if you need to exit the page and come back, hold off until you're about to submit it, only because you can't go back in and add it after it's been submitted. So we're working on giving you some flexibility around that though. Now, if you need to add your own custom session note fields, admin users can do this, so you can add drop down to check boxes, etc. And those would be placed just above our standard ones. So let's learn how to do that. I'm going to cancel out this session, and we're actually going to add some custom fields. Before we do that, we're going to go to admin. We're going to go to custom session notes. As I mentioned, only admins can do this. So first things first, we're going to create a session note set. So you can see here we have kind of, different sets of notes for different things. These session note options are not kind of implicitly assigned to anybody. What happens here is kind of like a company program in that once you actually assign these sets to somebody, you can modify them as needed. So we'll go over that too. So you just hit the plus to create your note set. You're going to call it something and hit create and setup. And then it's going to send us to a place like this where whatever you called it would be listed here. And then you just hit the plus and add some fields. So call your field something. And then what kind of field is it? A small text box, a big text box, drop downs, or check boxes. Obviously, if we have a drop down or a checkbox, we need some options to choose from. So we'll put those in. Now, if we actually want a certain client to have these fields, right, we would just go to the dashboard, or we would go to admin and clients. And just go to client data right here. So this client data menu is also accessible on your dashboard. Again, the only difference is that in your dashboard, you're only going to see clients that you're assigned to. All right, so we're going to go to client data. We're going to go to custom notes. And then you can see very similar to the program setup form, right? So here we've got some options we can choose from. Review is needed. But if we wanted to create something custom, we would just hit the plus. So let's add funding source A's field, so location, ABA techniques used, cool. If I also wanted to take some fields from funding source B, I can do that, except for that would be a little bit redundant, so we can just kind of remove it. There we go. If I need to modify this after, I can do that. And then let's say we're working on manding and we want to know all the things this specific client independently manded for, so I would just hit the plus and add that here, and let's make that a little text field. Cool. Now, next session, where we're always going to start a new session in order to see program or form changes. So we're going to hit start session here, and you can see there are those note fields, right? It's a home session. I'm a BCBA. We did stuff and things, and then they manded for bubbles. Cool. Now, if you want to see where your sessions go after they've been submitted, we would just go to client data and then go to session notes. If you got a question for supervisor, again, you're going to find the client identifier, the date and the name of the person who wrote it. So you can just kind of pop it open and there's your question, right? You'll also see obviously the start time, the end time, if they signed it, anything they wrote, as well as a summary of the data they collected that day, which is really handy if you're sharing a case with somebody, because then you can just kind of see how yesterday went so you know what to touch in on today, for example. If you wanted to look at all of the notes and prepare for an audit, for example, obviously it's not too easy to click individually, so instead just hit the printable notes option and you can see everything at once. These are copy and pasteable, so if you need to put them elsewhere, that's totally fine, or right, you could print it and save it as a PDF. Alrighty. If I needed to edit my session note, right, I would just pop it open and hit edit. Admins can edit anybody's, otherwise you can only edit your own. Only admins have access to this delete button, just because once you delete a session, that means the notes and the data go bye-bye. So we want to leave that button to those responsible for those kinds of changes. So I can modify the times. Obviously, we always want to make sure we have accurate session times, just because the rate per hour on your frequency graphs is pulled from your session length, which is determined here. And we can modify any of the text as well. You'll see again, we cannot modify the signature, so make sure you get that in with your original session submission. All right, next up, what we're gonna do is we're gonna review some program statistics. So if you needed to see kind of in table format your program data, or look at the raw data so you can see kind of trial by trial, target by target information, we would just go to client data and go to program stats. You can see kind of a list of all the programs, both active and inactive, and we would just kind of click on the one you want to see. if there's more than one person on the case, you might see many names here. What's handy about that is, let's say we get a new staff member on this date and the data goes ploop, that's kind of a training gap we might want to fill. If then we need more detail, right, we would just hit raw data and you can see it's going to start downloading an Excel spreadsheet, and that's again going to have that trial by trial, target by target, interval by interval, etc. data. If we had a program like colors where we had 3 targets in a list and our graph is only going to show, right, the percent correct of a whole, not specifically how they're doing with the color yellow. What's nice about the raw data for these kinds of programs is that there will actually be an added column in the spreadsheet that tells you percent correct per individual target, so you don't have to do the math yourself. All right, let's see some graphs. So if you just wanted to check in on one program, we would go to client programs, right? The same place where we added programs to this client. And then we would just find the program we want to see and hit view graph. You can see this is a frequency program. So right there, those are the frequency values I entered in session. If I also wanted to see rate per hour, if I want to see both, I'll just use this drop down and see both. You can see now it's kind of a heart, so sad. And if I wanted to just see the rate, it would look very strange, but we can totally do that. You can see any given graph in black and white, right, or narrow it down to specific date range. If you needed to save it as an image, you would just do that right here. Obviously, this is not the most efficient way to get all your graphs onto paper because you would have to save it, open, copy, paste, rinse, repeat. So I will go over how to use the treatment planning tool, and that's going to get all your graphs into a PDF in no time. That's going to be one of our next steps. But first, I wanted to show you how to look at multiple graphs at once. If you don't want to click on them one by one, instead, what we're going to do is go to client data and just go to current graphs. So these are going to be your active programs, right? And here are your archived ones. You can see, all the things at once. So here's a frequency graph. Again, we can see frequency and rate like we saw before. For any given graph, you can also add custom phase lines. So you can see right now, baseline, the treatment and maintenance generalization, those were automatically put there based on how I had my form set up. I also added a custom phase line here. Lowercase is totally fine. Mine just happens to be really excited. But we would just hit add phase line, call it something, tell us where to put it. And then is it only applying to one program, like a protocol change, right? Or is it going to apply to everything that's active, like a meds change, for example? Once you hit add, you will have to refresh the page in order for the new graph to kind of load itself with that new image included, or new line included, sorry. For any given graph, again, you can print it or save it here. Here is trials. You can see we had more than one list, which is why you see more than one graph. Here's that task analysis for hand washing. I did set it to forward chaining, which is why we get a line break kind of every time we advance to adding another step. You can see I did take prompt level data, which is why it's telling me kind of whatever the most obtrusive prompting level was, right? Like a model, a gesture, they just didn't do it, so it was just incorrect. You can always unclick it, or if you take plus minus data, right, it'll default to looking like this. Here's interval recording, so just kind of percent of intervals. You're always going to see a mastery line on any given graph, so you can see kind of what we're working toward. And the vocal stereotypy, here's a duration one. Currently, we are looking at the total duration in minutes. I can change the scale to seconds or hours if that better represents the data. If I also wanted to see the average duration per occurrence, I can use the drop down, right, or just the average or just the total. Alrighty. Next up, I think the only place we've got left is the treatment planning tool. So this is, again, a great way to get all of your graphs onto a PDF really quickly, or if you want to use it for official treatment planning, you totally can. So we're going to hop over to client data. We're going to go to treatment plans. All right, to start a treatment plan, we're going to hit the plus. Now it's going to ask you, kind of, are your client program forms up to date? And that just means, does everything you want included actually exist in ABAdesk, right? So if you've got upcoming programs you want to include in your treatment plan, go back and add them. This is kind of like going on a flight, right? You pack your suitcase, because once you hit agree, we're gone. The plane is leaving, and it's going to take a snapshot of all the programs kind of at this exact moment in time. All right, I would hit agree. I'm just going to continue an existing treatment plan just so we don't have 50 versions of the same thing. But you can see, right, all you really missed out on is me putting in the date. It will start off looking very much like this. So we're going to have to put in a date, And then here you're going to see kind of a bunch of standard, treatment plan fields that you might see. There are also, examples of what we could write here. So if you're supervising somebody who's a bit greener to this process, it does, scaffold it out in a way that doesn't look like 40 pages and crying. You can see it's all pretty clean and easy to get through. None of these fields are required, so if you've got your own template that you're using and you just want to use this for the graphs, that's fine. Or if you only want to use certain ones, only the fields that actually have text here are going to be included in the PDF. Here, you're going to see your programs are going to be sorted kind of across for decrease, mastered, and progress categories. If you feel like there's a better fit for a program, just use this drop down here and it'll move it to where it needs to go. There's also a hidden section, so anything you don't want included in the PDF, just put here. Obviously, you might need to take a closer look at the graphs in order to figure out where you want them to go. So just scroll down and you have the full versions of the graphs right down here. And then if you wanted to make it in black and white, etc., you can make those modifications here as well. Now, per program on the PDF, what you're going to get is the program name, the recording type, the category, and then obviously the graph or multiple graphs if it's a trials program. If you need more information, well, you might have already written that on the forms when you set up the programs. So for any behaviors for decrease, we'll just kind of pull, the entries from those relevant fields. Same thing for anything in acquisition. After that, if we need some more information, like if we wanted to narrate, etc., pop open the respective program, and you can see you can talk about the diagnostic criteria that you're targeting with this goal or behavior, right? A reference to your assessment, and even a narration field if you're like, ooh, like an extinction burst, then magic, or nothing, because again, none of these fields are required. None of the text fields here are, by the way. So if we're just trying to get our graphs onto a PDF really quickly, then we're good to go. We're going to save our progress, just because if you ever want to come back to it and have it still exist, we have to do that, definitely. And then we're going to hit PDF. Give it a second to load, and you can see it makes a neat little PDF document with everything we wanted included and none of the things we don't. Remember all those text fields we didn't fill out? They're not even here. If after that we need to make this really fancy and add our letterhead, etc., right, we would just download it. We were going to pop it open with Adobe Reader or similar software for PDFs, and then just export it as a Word file, because once it's a Word file, then you can do whatever you want with it. All right, again, if you ever need any help, please use the support link. So here, remember, we can, not only just report issues, but also, ask questions on the best use for ABAdesk. And again, we still have, a knowledge base where you're going to find articles on everything I mentioned today.